Layla and Imran's seemingly perfect life unraveled in a single night when Layla's secret affair with Sheriff Tom Callahan was exposed. What started as a desperate escape from a loveless marriage spiraled into a deadly game of betrayal, where loyalty was tested and lives were forever changed. What happens when the person you trust most betrays you in the most unimaginable way? This is the chilling true crime story of a Muslim wife's affair that ended in a grisly murder, and no one saw it coming. Ashbrook was a small, quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. It was the sort of place where you could trust your neighbor, leave your doors unlocked, and the sound of children playing in the streets was an everyday symphony. Life moved slowly, with a comforting predictability. But in the undercurrent of this peaceful existence, darker currents were stirring. Amina Hassan was the picture of a devoted wife and mother. At 32 years old, she had been married to Imran for almost a decade. The two had grown up in Ashbrook, their lives intertwined long before they became husband and wife. Imran was a successful contractor, well respected in the community, and Layla was a stay-at-home mom, a role she embraced with quiet grace. Together they had built a family and a life that seemed as perfect as the town they lived in. But behind the closed doors of their suburban home, things weren't as ideal as they appeared. The spark that had once ignited their marriage had faded, over time, replaced by routine and distance. Imran's work had become his obsession, and Layla, though proud of the life they had built, found herself feeling increasingly isolated and unfulfilled. They had grown apart emotionally, and the connection they once shared seemed distant, almost foreign to her. Layla often found herself thinking of the life she had left behind, the carefree days before marriage and motherhood, when she had dreams and desires that went beyond her duties as a wife and mother. She had no one to talk to about her feelings. Her friends had long since moved away, and the few family members she had left were too busy to offer much support. Her world had become a quiet, lonely existence that revolved around her children and her increasingly absent husband. It was during this lonely period that Layla first met Sheriff Tom Callahan. Tom had lived in Ashbrook for years, a reliable figure in the community. He had been the town sheriff for over a decade and was well liked by everyone who knew him. He was the kind of man who exuded calm authority, and his presence had a way of making people feel safe. When Layla met him at a community event, it was nothing more than a polite exchange. However, something about the way he looked at her, the attention he gave her, made her feel seen in a way that had been missing for a long time. Over the next few weeks, they crossed paths more frequently. Tom's kindness, his attentiveness, and his charm became a balm to Layla's growing emotional wounds. He was exactly what she needed at that moment, someone who saw her, who didn't look past her or ignore her the way Imran had been doing for months. Their interactions, at first innocent and friendly, soon became more personal. Layla found herself looking forward to the brief moments when she could talk to Tom. He made her feel special in a way she hadn't felt in years. One evening, after a community meeting, they sat together in a quiet corner of the local diner. Tom offered to buy her coffee, a gesture that felt genuine. The conversation flowed easily between them, and for the first time in a long time, Layla felt alive. Tom listened to her, truly listened. And when he spoke, it was as though he understood her in ways she never thought anyone could. His compliments were subtle, but they made her feel seen, admired, and for the first time in a while desired. Before long, their conversations turned into more frequent meetings. Layla found herself eagerly anticipating their private moments together, where the world outside seemed to fade away. It wasn't long before their innocent friendship blossomed into a passionate, secret affair. Each encounter, filled with stolen glances and hidden touches, only made Layla feel more alive, more important, and more wanted than she ever had in her marriage. The affair, though dangerous and filled with risk, gave her a sense of freedom she had never known before. But in the quiet corners of her mind, Layla couldn't escape the nagging feeling that her secret life would eventually unravel. She knew that she was walking a thin line, one that could lead to destruction if she wasn't careful. The guilt of betraying her husband and the fear of getting caught were ever present, but at that moment they were overshadowed by the thrill of her affair with Sheriff Callahan. She had crossed a line and there was no turning back now. As Layla's secret affair with Sheriff Tom Callahan continued, the distance between her and Imran grew even more pronounced. Their marriage, once founded on love and shared dreams, had become a shell of what it had been. Imran's long hours at work, combined with his increasing emotional distance, had left Layla feeling invisible in her own home. He no longer noticed her, didn't seem to care about the quiet sadness that had begun to settle in her eyes. The love they once shared felt like a distant memory, lost in the noise of everyday life. She had tried, time and time again, to rekindle the connection, but each attempt had fallen flat, leaving her more isolated than before. At the same time, Sheriff Callahan's presence had become a sharp contrast to Imran's cold indifference. Tom's attentiveness was like a balm to Layla's wounded spirit. He noticed the little things about her, how her hair curled in the morning light, the way her hands trembled when she was nervous, the small, fleeting glances she would cast when she thought no one was looking. These were the things that had been missing in her marriage, the simple acknowledgements that made her feel like a woman, not just a wife and mother. With Tom, she wasn't invisible. She was desired, and for the first time in years, she felt seen. Their meetings became more frequent, their encounters more intense. What had started as innocent coffee dates in quiet corners of the local diner evolved into passionate, stolen moments in secluded spots around town. They would sneak away to abandoned barns, dark corners of parking lots, and even quiet walks in the woods. Each meeting, each touch, left Layla feeling both alive and conflicted. She was betraying her husband, the father of her children, the man she had once promised to love and cherish. But the guilt, while ever present, was pushed to the back of her mind by the overwhelming need for affection and desire that she had long been deprived of. Meanwhile, Imran began to notice the subtle changes in Layla. She was more distant, more preoccupied, and her once vibrant smile had started to fade. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, but he could feel it, the growing tension in their home. Layla, who had once been so eager to spend time with him, was now increasingly absorbed in her own world, her eyes clouded with something he couldn't understand. Imran, though still in love with her, felt helpless. He had always worked long hours, and his business had consumed most of his time. But even with all the success he had achieved, he could sense something was slipping away. He tried to talk to Layla, but she would quickly brush him off with vague excuses or cold silences. She had become a stranger to him. Despite his concerns, Imran never suspected the truth. Layla had become an expert at hiding her affair, weaving a web of lies to keep her secret safe. She was careful, calculating, always ensuring that Tom was never seen with her when Imran was around. She had become paranoid too, always looking over her shoulder, wondering if someone might catch on. But each moment with Tom was worth the risk. They shared an undeniable connection, one that seemed impossible to break. The guilt, however, started to eat away at Layla. Her love for her children kept her anchored, but she found herself becoming more and more disconnected from the life she had once fought so hard to build. Each stolen kiss, each whispered promise in the dark, was a constant reminder of the double life she was leading. And though she told herself that she had no other choice, that her marriage was beyond repair, deep down, she knew that this path she was walking would ultimately lead to disaster. Imran's suspicions grew with each passing day. He began following Layla, watching her leave the house at odd hours, sometimes with an empty look in her eyes, sometimes with a sense of guilt that was impossible to hide. But each time he tried to confront her, she would shut him out, making excuses or playing the victim, hiding behind her carefully constructed facade. Layla's internal struggle became unbearable. She had fallen into a world of deception, trapped between her love for her children and the thrilling escape she had found in Tom's arms. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep this secret forever. And when the truth finally came to light, it would tear everything apart. The inevitable confrontation between Imran and Layla seemed to hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. As the days passed, Imran's suspicions transformed into quiet, simmering certainty. He could no longer ignore the signs, the late nights, the cold silences, the distant look in Layla's eyes when he would ask about her day. He had always been a patient man, content with his work, but now he was on edge, every glance from Layla feeling like a betrayal. He had been so consumed with his business that he hadn't seen it coming. But now the truth was slowly unveiling itself. Imran wasn't sure what had pushed him over the edge. Maybe it was the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume lingering on her clothes, or the strange way she would avoid eye contact when he asked where she had been. But he knew something was terribly wrong. That night, after weeks of watching her leave and return at odd hours, Imran decided to follow her. He had stayed up late, pretending to be asleep as Layla got ready, as she always did, to leave the house. He watched her slip out the door and into her car, trying to act casual as if nothing was amiss. His heart pounded as he quietly got dressed and followed her, trying to keep his distance while remaining unnoticed. The journey was torturous. Imran drove through the familiar streets of Ashbrook, his mind racing with every turn. Where was she going? Who was she meeting? He couldn't shake the sick feeling in his stomach, but he couldn't stop himself either. He needed to know, to confront the truth, no matter how painful it would be. Layla's car eventually turned down a secluded road that led into the woods, a place on the outskirts of town that few ventured. Imran slowed his car, pulling off to the side, hiding behind the trees, watching her disappear into the darkness. Waited, his pulse quickening as time passed. Every creak and groan of his car seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. When Layla's headlights finally returned, Imran's heart sank. She wasn't alone. The figure sitting beside her in the passenger seat was unmistakable. Sheriff Tom Callahan, the man she had been secretly meeting for weeks. Imran's world collapsed in on itself as he watched the two of them exchange a brief, intimate touch before Layla drove off again, oblivious to the fact that her husband had witnessed it all. Imran could hardly breathe. The realization hit him like a freight train. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted, had been cheating on him with Tom, the sheriff of their town. Anger, betrayal, and disbelief all crashed into him at once, a storm of emotions that threatened to tear him apart. He had never imagined that it would come to this. His mind spun as he tried to process what he had just seen, but there was no denying the truth. Layla, the woman he had built a life with, was no longer the person he thought she was. For the next few days, Imran kept his distance, retreating into silence. He became consumed by a dark cloud of anger and hurt, but he still wasn't sure what to do. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the weight of his own emotions made him hesitant. What would he say? How would he react? The idea of losing his family, of seeing the woman he once loved in a completely new light, terrified him. Finally, after days of brooding, Imran made up his mind. He couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. He had to face her. He had to confront Layla and demand the truth. There was no way out of it, no more hiding from the painful reality that had shattered his world. He spent the day preparing, steeling himself for what was to come. As the evening set in, he knew it was time. He would go to the cabin in the woods, the one place he knew where Layla had been meeting Callahan. He had to hear it from her own lips, had to know if this affair was real. Imran's heart was heavy as he drove down the same road that had led him to the painful discovery. The cabin stood dark and silent in the distance, like a witness to all the lies that had been told. As he neared the building, his mind raced with 1,000 questions, each more painful than the last. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as he parked his car and quietly got out. The confrontation, he knew, would change everything. What he didn't anticipate was the chain of events he was about to set in motion. The deadly collision of betrayal, fear, and violence that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The air was thick with tension as Imran stood outside the cabin, the sounds of the night swallowed by the quiet woods surrounding him. His mind raced with 1,000,000 thoughts, but one kept repeating itself. He had to know the truth. His breath quickened as he approached the cabin, each step heavier than the last. The distant light from inside flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow across the trees. Imran's hands trembled, not just from fear, but from the rage that had been building inside him ever since he first followed Layla. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't allow his marriage to end in lies, couldn't let his wife continue her affair with someone who had once been a trusted figure in their community. Sheriff Callahan, the man who had sworn to protect Ashbrook, had broken that very trust. And now Imran was determined to make him face the consequences. He approached the door, careful not to make a sound, the anger boiling inside him like a storm waiting to explode. He was about to knock when he heard voices from inside, muffled but unmistakable. Layla. Callahan. Imran froze, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. There was no mistaking it now. Layla was inside with the man who had stolen her heart, the man who had caused his world to crumble. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, a gut-wrenching mix of hurt and betrayal that threatened to consume him. His eyes narrowed as he listened, trying to make out the words, but it was no use. The voices were too soft. He couldn't hear them clearly, but the very fact that they were there, together in that cabin, was all the confirmation he needed. Imran's stomach twisted in knots. He had been deceived for months, But the depth of it, the complete betrayal of the woman he had loved and trusted, hit him like a physical blow. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to offer a glimpse of the interior. Imran's eyes darted to the opening, and for a brief moment he considered storming in and confronting them right there, but something held him back. It wasn't fear, it was a sudden clarity that hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about Layla and Callahan anymore. This was about his life, his future, the very foundation of everything he had built. If he let this anger consume him, if he allowed himself to give in to the urge to lash out, it would all be over. And so would everything they had. Imran took a step back, his mind racing. He needed to calm down. He needed to think. He couldn't let this turn into something irreversible. As he retreated further into the shadows, his thoughts began to spiral. He had always been the calm one in their relationship, the one who kept things together. But this was a different kind of betrayal. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't pretend he didn't know. He knew then that he couldn't go back to Layla the way things were. The trust between them had been shattered beyond repair. But what he didn't expect, as he stood there in the dark, was the sudden realization that everything was already out of his control. He was no longer just an angry husband. The situation had escalated beyond a simple confrontation. There was no coming back from this. Inside the cabin, Layla and Callahan's voices grew louder, more urgent. Imran's pulse raced as his body tensed, the familiar feeling of rage bubbling back up, but now it had a new edge, an edge of desperation. He couldn't stop himself anymore. He was too far gone. Just as he made the decision to face them, the door swung open and there they were, Layla, standing in front of him, caught completely off guard. Sheriff Callahan was right behind her, his expression shifting from confusion to fear in an instant. The moment hung suspended in time, a mixture of disbelief and raw emotion thick in the air. Imran felt as though he were outside of his body, watching the scene unfold in front of him like a nightmare. His voice, when it finally broke through, was low and strained with anger, but also tinged with pain. He didn't recognize himself anymore. Layla, wide-eyed and trembling, took a step back. Her lips parted as though she wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Callahan's hand instinctively went to his side, his fingers brushing the holstered gun, but he hesitated. It was the wrong move. Imran saw it. The officer, the man he once trusted, was just as much a part of this mess as Layla. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. It hit Imran harder than anything else. In the split second before anything else could happen, the rawness of the situation, the fury and the confusion collided. Imran's mind screamed for him to do something, say something, fight, confront, but his body froze. The cabin stood like a silent witness to the chaos about to erupt. The silence was unbearable, and in that silence, the twisted series of events that had begun with a simple, careless affair was now spiraling towards something far darker than anyone could have predicted. Imran stood there frozen, staring at his wife and the sheriff, their faces a mix of shock and fear, mirroring the whirlwind of emotions inside him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the anger and hurt roiling inside him like an uncontrollable storm. The pain was almost unbearable, as if every ounce of trust he had placed in Layla had been shattered in an instant. He had come here to confront them, to demand answers, but now that he was face to face with the reality of the situation, he felt lost. His mind raced. each thought colliding with the next in a blur of confusion. Layla's eyes darted between Imran and Callahan, her expression one of guilt, fear, and something else, something darker. Imran couldn't read it, couldn't process the emotions swirling in her gaze. The woman he had spent years with, the mother of his children, was standing in front of him with the man who had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. The weight of it all threatened to suffocate him. Imran's voice broke through the thick silence, though it came out low, hoarse, as if the words themselves weighed more than he could bear. He barely recognized the sound of his own voice, strained, broken, filled with emotion that he hadn't known how to express until this moment. What were you thinking, Layla? He asked, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to shout, to scream at her, but he couldn't. Instead, the anger morphed into something else, something colder, more calculated. It was disbelief. It was the recognition that everything he had known, everything he had believed in, was a lie. How could you do this to me? To us? Layla's face crumpled, the tears finally spilling from her eyes. But it wasn't enough to make Imran's heart soften. She had crossed a line that could never be undone, and no amount of regret would change that. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words seemed to fail her. What could she say? How could she justify the affair, the lies, the deception? Behind her, Callahan stood motionless, his face unreadable. He was the lawman, the man who was supposed to uphold justice, but now he was just as much a part of the betrayal as Layla. His presence made everything worse, like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Imran's eyes locked onto his, and, for the first time, he saw the flicker of fear in Callahan's expression. The sheriff had been caught in his own web of lies, and now there was no escape. Imran felt his hands tighten into fists, his body trembling with the weight of everything he had just discovered. The betrayal had been raw and brutal. But now that the truth was out, he didn't know what to do with it. His mind told him to take action, to demand justice, but his heart was still shattered. His world had been turned upside down, and he was struggling to find any semblance of control. Do you know what this is going to do to our family, Layla? Imran's voice was barely a whisper now, thick with emotion. Do you know what this will do to our children? At the mention of their children, Layla's face twisted with guilt, but it only served to make Imran more furious. She had betrayed him, and now she was realizing the full extent of her actions, the destruction they would leave in their wake. He had given her everything, and she had thrown it all away for a few moments of stolen passion. Callahan stepped forward, his voice low but firm. Imran, I never meant for it to go this far. Shut up. Imran cut him off, his voice rising. For the first time, he couldn't bear to hear Callahan's excuses, couldn't stand the sound of the man who had taken everything from him trying to justify his actions. The sheriff took a step back, but Imran didn't care. He was done with words. Imran turned to Layla, his eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and anger. I don't know who you are anymore, he said, his voice trembling. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. You've destroyed everything we had. I don't even know where to go from here. Layla opened her mouth again, but this time there was nothing more to say. She had no defense, no excuse. She had let everything slip through her fingers, and now it was too late. The affair had gone on for far too long, and there was no undoing the damage it had caused. Imran turned away from her, from both of them, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't stay here, Not with them. Not in this place, where everything had come crashing down. As he walked toward his car, the cold reality of the situation settled in. He was alone now, and the life he had built was in ruins. The love he had for Layla, the trust he had placed in her, was gone. It had all been a lie. As Imran drove away from the cabin, he didn't look back. He couldn't. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead seemed impossibly dark, but he knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The betrayal had been too deep, the wounds too raw.